So where is the bank? Also my batchmate from GMG left the service. वो तो फिर गाड़ी लग गया लेकिन उसके अलावा आज अच्छा कॉमन है ये दोनों ने अच्छा you also I saw ये बहुत बड़ी fraternity है. It's bigger than more often. The ones that didn't last or didn't want to last. Didn't last, want to leave.
We'll just give it a couple more minutes and then we'll begin. Thanks.
If you're too long, West Coast person, you know what you're doing. Okay, just so that I know my report. Make sure. Take it as
Good afternoon, all. Thank you for joining us for this panel on Pakistan's security situation. My name is Moeed Yusuf. I direct the South Asia program here at USIP and have been here for too long to remember. But today's event is really special, at least for me, but also for Pakistan watchers. Because I don't think any of us who are interested in this country and what has been going on there for the past decade or so can forget the 16th of December 2014. And I don't think any of us will. This is, of course, the Peshawar attack on the Army Public School. 150 or upwards is the number of young innocent kids killed in that attack. And you've heard all sorts of stories of survivors, of those who didn't survive, of parents, of the government, etc. What we are here to discuss is what came out of this at the Pakistan government and state level. I was in Pakistan throughout this period, just before Peshawar happened, then when it happened, and then the 2 weeks after. And I have to say that I personally have not seen the Pakistani people and the state moved in a way that this attack did. I mean, there have been many horrendous attacks in Pakistan before this, but there was something about this which really shook everybody, and it's quite obvious what it was. The hope then, of course, was that after this, the state will actually get its act together on some of the things that it hasn't managed to so far, and this will really be a turning point for Pakistan in its fight against terrorism. And there have been a number of steps that have been taken by the government and the various provincial authorities since, which I let my speakers talk to. But the real question we want to answer today is, what does all of this mean? Pakistan has come up with various security policies, various security strategies over the past 4, 5, 6, 7 years. Some very high-profile ones, like the National Internal Security Policy last year, which went through a whole process of consensus building over a year, and then they came up with an internal security document. A new one that we hear, or a new term we hear after Peshawar, is the National Action Plan, and there are many others. What does all of this amount to? Are we really looking or looking at a point where things are going to take a turn for the better, irreversibly so, or is this just a blip where things may go back to where they've been? To talk about all of this, we have a very special panel, and I'm grateful to the three panelists here for joining us. I'll introduce them very briefly. None of them actually need any introductions. I'm sure all of you have either heard or seen or met them. But let me just quickly introduce them, and then we'll get to business. Peter Lavoie, to my left, long time Pakistan expert, has lived in Pakistan, speaks the native language. He is now a partner at Monitor 360, a Washington-based firm. Before that, he was the acting assistant secretary for defense at the DoD. He served in the office of the National Intelligence Director, and various other hats before that. He's been an academic as well. But if anybody knows sort of the nuclear and non-proliferation field in South Asia, you wouldn't have missed Peter's name. So Peter, thank you very much for being here. To my right is my current colleague, Raza Rumi, who is a senior Pakistan expert at USIP, is doing a very interesting study on internal security in Pakistan for us, and he'll be speaking through parts of that study today. Raza otherwise is a former Pakistani civil servant, and he wears more hats than I care to remember, to be honest. He's been with the Asian Development Bank, he's a journalist, he's anchored a TV program. He is a habitual or addicted Twitter fan, whichever way you want to put it, and virtually everything else. But he's somebody who's very well recognized for his commentary on Pakistani politics. He also is somebody who had the unfortunate event of being attacked by militants in Pakistan not too long ago. And that's one of the reasons that he came to the US. Mr. Zulfikar Hamid is an even more special guest. He happens to be in Washington right now with the New America Foundation, but he's a serving Pakistani police officer who served as the Deputy Inspector General of Investigations in Lahore and has held various other senior police posts in the Punjab. And one of the reasons to have him here is this whole talk about Punjab and southern Punjab being the hotbed of extremism but not being touched, and there's all sorts of controversies around that. So we'll hear from the horse's mouth, if you will, on what the challenges of security and policing and counterterrorism in Punjab are. So with that, let me stop here and go to my guests. We'll start with Peter, come to Raza, and then go to Mr. Hamid, and then we'll open it up for questions. Thanks.
Okay, thank you very much, Moeed, and thank you for the opportunity to be here and an opportunity to discuss this very, very important issue. And it's a very hard issue to talk about as well. We're really talking about not just one event that has catalyzed the nation of Pakistan into a desire for action, But frankly, when I was serving in the government and other points, I've heard this said so many times before. After Benazir Bhutto's assassination, after other really notable, terrible attacks in the country, after the attack on the Karachi airport that galvanized public opinion, and most recently, this terrible attack on the school in Peshawar. And the question that really I'm grappling with, how much does it take? How much suffering will it take to actually galvanize the nation into real action to more meaningfully curb this threat? And so what I did is leverage some of the tools of the company I work for now, Monitor 360, a small consulting company that does big data analytics to actually look at how people in different organizations or different countries view the world and how they think about change in those circumstances. So if you bear with me, I've got a short presentation to walk you through the method we're using and really focus in on the narratives that are at play, very dynamically at play in Pakistan today, and how these narratives create space or constrain the opportunities for the government to take more meaningful action, and constrain or create opportunities for the United States and other concerned countries to engage Pakistan and to come up with collaborative programs to address the threat. So that's what I'll do. If we can go to I guess I'm in control here. It's a change. When you leave the government, you have a little more autonomy. So really the two questions I'll be talking about here are what Pakistani elites, and I'll define that term more specifically in a moment, how they think about the causes of the terrorist violence in Pakistan today, and the second question, what do they think should be done to address that problem? So two questions, and looking at it through a narrative lens. And first of all, let me just define this, what we mean by narratives, and our company has a particular approach to this. I just want to share with you because this will be the prism through which, I guess it's our narrative in looking at these. So narratives, as depicted on the slide, they are the stories that reflects a community's identity and experiences, and oftentimes are used to explain its hopes, aspirations, fears. Now, we look at master narratives as the deeply rooted cultural views that change very infrequently over time, that these are rooted in the cultural understandings and don't change much. And our company does some reports on these that we call master narratives. But we also have recognized that there are many beliefs that do change more frequently. We do see these as narratives, and it's the change, the fluidity of these narratives that creates space for political and social action. And so the tool we use to describe that is called narrative analytics, which is our approach to look at big data sources, in many cases, and in this case, media data, large quantity of media data, and then analyzes that to discern the narratives. So that's the approach we're using here. And so basically there are 3 steps to this approach, so I'll just share with you those steps, and that's the methodology, then I'll get into the findings. So the first thing, we begin by mapping and clarifying the conversation, in this case, among the Pakistani public. We can look at other groups. We provide this product for corporations as well, and we can look at the views of their employees. So any kind of data set that we have access to, we can use to get this kind of information. And this data is all readily available. It's commercially available. We have to pay for it. It's a commodity. So this is not what you get. Maybe there's some other agencies that get this data through other means. But we do not avail ourselves of those services. So this is all above board, standard open source engagement. And so we look at traditional media, blog networks and fora, and Twitter activity. Raza, we probably have you, we've probably got a good profile on you right now too. You might even pop up in here. And so what we do is then you have this graphic here, and basically that's a cluster, that's a visualization of all these data entities put together, and then we try to identify what are the narratives at play. And so we have some proprietary tools that we use to do that. Then once we've identified the narratives, we play with them. We look at insights that the data, that the surface data tells us, and try to kind of leverage those insights. And so we'll look at the volume of certain messages. We'll look at sharing. So with all your Twitter fans, Raza, and the degree to which they share and comment on your tweets, that's important because your influence is very important. Who are the key influencers? That's very important to know about these things if you want to understand, navigate, and perhaps even influence the narrative landscape. There's some other factors. I won't get into all these. If you have questions, I'd be happy to. But together then we have basically a cumulative score, a composite score that measures the impact of different narratives in whatever organization or country we're talking about. And so then the third step is looking at this not just statically, but looking at this dynamically. So looking at how this changes over time. And we have an example here. This is just illustrative. It's not real. But let's just say that when Pakistanis look at the causes of terrorism in their country, you could theoretically, in fact you do, have some narratives that really blame the causes on outside factors. Blame it on the US, blame it on India, blame it on Al-Qaeda. And then you have other narratives that blame it on internal factors, misgovernance, the work of the security establishment, or other factors inside the state. And so if you just looked at that illustration over time, you could see how as the narratives change, fluctuate over time, you can then look at what happens in the real world. Was there an attack? Was there a government action? Was there some event that really triggered that change? And then you can attribute more causation around that. So what this does in comparison, say, to polling data is very powerful, but it's purely descriptive of what people think when you get that data. So this tool, we find it's much more explanatory and offers deep insights as to why people believe what they believe and where are the possibilities of them changing their minds. So let me now get into the substance of our findings as we've done this research on Pakistan. So we've gone in, and that is a map. It's a little weird. It's a visualization of the narrative landscape in Pakistan around violent extremism. Okay, so we looked at many, and there's a certain number, but many media sources, and we looked at these going back through 2013. So we did this over 2 years, about 2 years, and we looked at how these narratives changed over time, and through the media we identified basically 8 the more prominent narratives at play in the country. Now, we could, if we wanted to look at a certain subset, so if we wanted to look at this in the Pashtun media, for example, it would reveal a different pattern. This is entirely through the English media, so these are the newspapers that you may read or other media channels and blogs, all in English. So I want to caveat that our findings are of the English-speaking sort of media elite in Pakistan on these issues. And so I'll explain these, but what you have here in the big blobs depict the dominance of certain narratives over other narratives. Okay, so I'll get into a little bit more detail of each of these. So we identified 4 prominent narratives when it comes to explaining why Pakistan is facing the terrorist threat it faces. And these are this cumulative weighting or the impact score. You can see 2 are really powerful, 2 dominate the media landscape. And all of you are interested in this issue. Probably most of you spend a lot of time reading Pakistani media, so this will probably not come as a big surprise. There's some other cases where we are very surprised, or our client is extremely surprised with the findings, because there is a subjective lens through which we all view the media or other information, in this big data quantitative lens sometimes reveals things that escape our biased approach. So basically the four narratives are, first, that conflict in Pakistan, political conflict, social conflict, is really driven by the Punjabi-dominated government and elite and their mishandling and mistreatment of ethnic minorities in the country. And in the case of violent extremism, the sense is here that the grievances of these, particularly in Fatah, but also elsewhere in Pashtun areas or Baluchistan, these grievances have been allowed to fester and they become a breeding ground for violent extremism. So this narrative really puts the blame at the doorstep of the Punjabi elite in the country. And you can see, this is the composite score, that is the most prominent narrative we've found in the Pakistan media over this period of time. The second most prominent one is that Pakistan is a victim of the U.S. war on terror and its 13 years of military operations in Afghanistan, and that our activities in the region, drone use, other activities, have alienated Muslims and sparked tribal conflict in the region, and also created a condition where now the TTP and other militants can find safe haven in Afghanistan and are free to come across the border to attack Pakistan. So that's a very powerful narrative as well. The two other narratives that we identified are much less powerful. One is that the militants inside Pakistan were really created by the Pakistan Army and ISI, and they were created for use as a foreign policy proxy against Afghanistan and India. And now the security establishment has lost control, and that's why the problem is so big. And the other one is that what's very interesting, very low prominence, although in government channels this is very prominent, but in media channels, very, very low salience, is that the TTP may be indigenous in Pakistan, an indigenous problem, but the support provided by India and Afghanistani security agencies are what basically make this threat so big today. Okay, so these are the explanatory narratives inside Pakistan. And then when you look at the prescriptive narratives, we see four, and you'll see some connection here too. Again, the most prominent one is that in order to deal with this problem, you need a long-term governmental campaign to improve education, raise living standards, enact de-radicalization measures, political and legal reforms. That's really what's required. Second one, in terms of prominence, is military crackdown. The military needs to get a lot tougher. This is a problem of law and order and violence, and you can only deal with these violent extremists through violence, and you need to wipe them out. And you also need to use the new measures created by the 21st Amendment, the military courts, and capital punishment. Less prominent is an Islamist narrative that violence will only be curbed when Pakistan adopts true Sharia law and rids the country of corrupt, Western perhaps, but anti-Islamist forces. And then also relatively small in the conversation in the media is that the way to deal with this is by negotiating with these militant groups, not by fighting them. Okay, so that's the descriptive narrative landscape in Pakistan from our study. So now let me just share with you 8 insights and then turn it over to the other speakers who need to navigate this narrative landscape and I think what they're talking about. So the first, again, follows what I was talking about, the ethnic discontent of the country. It's a very, very powerful force. And when I reflect on what we in the U.S. government, when I used to work in the government, how we engaged Pakistan, we had a total blind spot for this issue. This was something we did not engage in at all, and partly because it's such a deeply sensitive internal political issue for any country, its ethnic composition. But there is a very prominent view that terrorism is allowed to take place if it's taking place outside, let's say, the settled areas, and particularly outside Punjab. If it's in Fatah or Khyber Pakhtunkhwa, it's unfortunate, but it's allowed to happen. When it comes home to the heartland of the country, then it's unacceptable. And I think we've seen this, and when the SWAT violence started deepening, really mainstream Pakistanis got up and demanded action, much more so when violence was really dominating and totally overturning the political and social order in Western Pakistan. The second insight is that elites are more inward focused today than they have been in recent years. That they look at these, as I mentioned, the internal drivers or causes, and they want their government to be accountable. There's a very strong narrative and a growing frustration in Pakistan that the government is not accountable and is not getting results in this area. A third insight is that what's interesting, this narrative that militants are a proxy of the Pakistan state, and you've heard other countries refer to this as state-sponsored terrorism, that this has a very minimal impact in the media conversation. And you know, there are probably a few reasons for that. One, it's a taboo subject, and you're aware of certain media personalities who have raised these issues and have been dealt with pretty harshly by the security establishment. But whatever the causation or the attribution, the fact is this is not a very dominant theme in the media conversation in Pakistan today. A fourth insight that comes out of this is that the narrative landscape is changing. It's very dynamic, and Moeed already pointed to this earlier. Fully agree, the data supports that. And what you see in the past is more prominence of narratives that would blame the West or the United States for Pakistan's internal political or social problems, and now they're looking inward. The narrative landscape has shifted, and it's really seen either an opportunity or a need for Pakistan to deal with this issue, largely because of the U.S. drawdown in Afghanistan. So what really was focused externally has now become a more internally focused narrative. The fifth insight is that is really, and this surprised me, but I probably should not be surprised with these media channels. And again, maybe looking at the more indigenous language, the Urdu language press, you would probably find a very different narrative, and that would be a really interesting study to compare these two. But in the English narrative, the Islamist view is not prominent. And in fact, there is a larger chorus of sentiment that is calling for more secular reforms, moving away from Sharia and more to more secular government action. And in particular, after the terrible Peshawar school attack, that there is a growing tenor in the media debate accusing the radical clerics, their narrative, as being supportive or creating an intellectual environment where TTP can flourish. The sixth narrative is, again, that the specific institutional reforms are needed. And there is a growing and more vibrant conversation about what these reforms should look like, police and legal reforms, reforming the broader legal system, including police and courts, other kinds of reforms as well. And particularly a growing attention to the conditions that cause radicalization and the search for de-radicalization programs to address those causes at the roots. The seventh narrative, and again, this looks at the picture more dynamically over time, that you have, what's interesting here, the support for military responses, military crackdowns to the TTP and other violent extremists operating in Pakistan fluctuates wildly over the years. It is like a roller coaster. And here in red is the narrative in support of media crackdown. In blue is the support for negotiations. So just taking two narratives and comparing them dynamically over time in terms of how much prominence they have in the conversation. And this only starts in the third quarter of 2013. As you would know, if you went back to 2003, The blue, or the negotiations narrative, would be much more prominent. The military crackdown, I think, probably insignificant at that period of time. So what you're looking at is just basically a 2-year most recent snapshot of how this trend has evolved. And what you're seeing is just a much greater support for military crackdown than for negotiations. Okay, the final insight that we have, and here we just have a snippet from one article in Daily Times, because I think it really put this out. And this is to nuance the point I just made before, where there's a growing tenor in support of military crackdown. What we see here also is that that is insufficient. It's a necessary condition, but an insufficient condition to deal with the problem. So that might be useful for the clearing, but for the holding and governing and developing, you need a whole series of government reforms and governance and economic development to deal with the problem. Okay, so those are our findings. Let me just tell you three more methodological angles as we do this kind of research, things that we can look at, just so for your awareness. We can break down the segmentation. The great thing about data, and why big data analytics is so popular, to the extent that that data is tagged with maybe the demographic information, geographic information, media type, and other channels, you can then segment it and discern the trends across those categories, across those segments. And we do this for client, government, and non-governmental clients. So you could theoretically look at, okay, what is the military in the blogs of serving or retired officers or soldiers? What is the narrative among them? Or you could look at it as narrow as MFA, or the government, or you could look at it PMLN versus PPP. So and you could look at it, in the Pashtun area, the Pashtun belt, or in Sindh, or in Islamabad. So you can bound this, and then once you identify where those narratives are, pollinate them with those segments, you can really get interesting patterns. And let's just say, if the government of Pakistan wants to take this issue more seriously, it would be very well informed to understand the narrative landscape at a nuanced level. I'm sure they get it at a gut reaction. I mean, they're politicians. Politicians intuitively understand this. But to do this a little bit more scientifically, it gives you a lot more traction on the problems. At least that's our belief. And then the other thing you can look at is key influencers. There are certain people at certain times that will change the narrative landscape, because their views, for various reasons, end up driving and influencing the views of others. Raza is a great example. That's not your Twitter handle there, Raza.
I hope so.
Okay. And then finally, the other thing, if you take this approach or some other similar approach seriously, there's certain metrics that you can develop, and we do this for our clients. There's certain metrics you can develop that can help you understand how your own communication strategy or your own engagement strategy is working, how it has an impact on the narrative landscape. And we do that for companies that are trying to get into new markets and government clients as well. And so this metrics dashboard enables you to then have a strategic tool to help you navigate the narrative landscape more effectively. Thank you.
Thanks, Peter. This is fascinating and a lot to digest there. Raza?
Thank you, Mohit. I will start with saying that Peter has actually set the right context for what I'm going to say. In particular, some of the kind of narratives that permeate Pakistani mindset regarding both militancy and extremism, and its genesis in the country as well. So, I'm at USIP for the past few months. What I have been doing is looking at some of these issues, and in particular, what has been the policy response of the Pakistani government and the various sections of the state. My primary focus when I started my work was on the
the key policy document, the NISP, the Internal Security Policy, which was approved almost a year ago and has been under implementation since then. But then this unfortunate Peshawar attack took place, and that also, gave me some more insights into the kind of responses we are now seeing in Pakistan, both by the people as well as the state. And surely, as Mohit mentioned at the start of this debate, that never has Pakistan appeared so determined and clear in fighting and combating the various manifestations of terrorism as it is perhaps now. And some of what the data that Peter showed us kind of confirms that. Particularly the trends in not negotiating with the terrorists, in taking firm and clear action against them. So in this context, what is also important is to remember that Pakistan's internal security is actually driven and linked to its perception of its external insecurity. Pakistan has been an insecure state, since 1947, and it has that narrative, which is the official state-sponsored thesis about Pakistan's existence, that it came into being as an anomaly to India, and India would be willing to dismember it or harm it or break it or lord over its decline. And sadly, 1971, that whole prophecy was partly fulfilled. It was not solely India's doing, because Pakistani policies were much to be accounted for. But Indian intervention in 1971 to support the Bengali nationalism and the creation of Bangladesh has left a deep scar on the security framework of Pakistan and how the military views Pakistan's security. And that is what matters at the end of the day. And in that context, the India-centric security view then drives how the internal security has to be managed. And in part, this whole narrative of external forces at work, whether they are Indians or whether they are later in the more recently the Americans, is a kind of a national belief system. And it is very difficult to challenge that and undo that. It would require decades of very hard work, because that is what the Pakistani textbooks state, that is what the military doctrines say, that is what an ordinary Pakistani, you ask them and they would kind of confirm that, India is the enemy and we are threatened, and therefore all militias that target India or vow to target India are sort of kosher. And that is where the problem of larger internal security emerges, because if you have certain militias which are directed towards India and have direct or indirect support of the state, then it is very difficult to tackle the other militias that have emerged in the recent decades against the Pakistani state. And TTP is a prime example of that offshoot of the jihad infrastructure that has been in place for nearly 3 decades now. I'll quickly go to the policy sort of documents and frameworks that guide the counterterrorism operations now. And it's also amazing that the issue of terrorism and civilian deaths and horrific bomb blasts is not new. Only in last 5 years, 1,000 schools were blown up by the Taliban, and that's data compiled by the Human Rights Watch. Over 50 Sufi shrines have been targeted in the last 6 years. There have been ghastly incidents against women and kids in Peshawar, in Lahore, in other parts, in Quetta, where civilians have been targeted. But the Peshawar school, with that mass scale of brutal murder of kids, changed the narrative, and more so because it was an army school, and a lot of kids there had relationships with the military officials. Either they were directly kids or somehow linked to that. So I think finally the realization dawned in the Pakistani policymakers that they have to do something and stand clear and appear to be firm and clear-headed with view to the militancy challenge. The national internal security policy was drafted last year in 2013, and it was formally approved almost a year ago by the federal cabinet, and since then it has been under implementation. And it is also ironic that the previous civilian government did not even come up with a comprehensive policy document which would tackle the challenge of internal security. The approach was to outsource the whole range of security matters to the military, whether it was external or internal. And with the election in 2013, which sent Mr. Nawaz Sharif to the PM House with a thumping majority, was a kind of beginning of a civilian assertion. And Mr. Sharif, before this policy, also tried to change the way Pakistan's internal security was being managed, and he created a new body at the cabinet level, which would deal with the security matters, and which would be chaired by the PM, comprising all the military chiefs and the intelligence heads. And later on, this policy document came into being, but somehow, after its launch, the government did not show the kind of commitment through resources and the necessary institutional measures that were required to implement that. And in particular, in the budget of 2013 and 14 financial year, there was no allocation whatsoever for these special purpose counterterrorism operations. And so the NISP remained kind of a resource-starved policy framework for a long time until this Peshawar incident, and now with the announcement of the National Action Plan, there has been a firm declaration by the government which intends to provide more resources to implement some of the key measures outlined in the second iteration of the security policy, which is known as the National Action Plan, or NAP. It is a 20-point agenda which was announced by the Prime Minister. Almost 17 or 18 points are a regurgitation of the NISP that was earlier in place, except two key items. One is the establishment of the military courts, and the second is the reintroduction of capital punishment to create deterrence and to sort of demonstrate that the state is serious about punishing those who perpetrate terrorism. And thus far, I think over 20 convicted terrorists have been hanged, and hundreds are supposed to be hanged in the current year. I think we'll see more of that. That's partly has to do with the kind of public mood, the kind of national opinion on vengeance and immediate action, and there's a very split view on that, whether it's going to actually lead to the achievement of objectives under NAP. Similarly, there's a 21st constitutional amendment that was enacted by the Parliament in early January, and that amends both the Army Act and the Constitution, and sets up military courts for speedy justice. The narrative in Pakistan, which was also kind of changed after Peshawar, was that the failure of the judicial system was somehow the key cause for the rise of militancy and terror in Pakistan. And that is partly true as well, because Pakistan's courts are unable, for various reasons, for a very weak prosecutorial system, for problems with police investigation and the security of judges and witnesses, that only 2 to 3% of those charged with terrorism are actually punished or convicted. The rest are either set free or languish in jails, or there are jailbreaks. As you've seen, there have been 2 or 3 major jailbreaks, releasing hundreds of militants by force. And the NAP sort of addresses that, and there has been, in the past 2 weeks, immense progress on that, particularly in the province of Punjab, where for the first time in almost a decade, the militant infrastructure in terms of seminaries, training camps, hate literature, and publishing hate material have been cracked down. Dozens of clerics who preach hatred have been arrested. These are new developments in Pakistan. We have been articulating that for almost a decade now, saying do this, and finally it seems that it is happening. But there's a problem here. The problem is that the civilian government is in place. It tried to take charge of security. It tried to rearrange the security architecture. But it seems that either it has admitted to its failure, or that the military has assumed the driving seat position, and so the army chief appears to be taking the lead, which is okay with Pakistani public opinion, by the way, because the civilian governments and political parties are either viewed as weak or soft on the terrorists, because they have been, they had been advocating for a compromise with the Pakistani Taliban for long. And secondly, that the paradox of Pakistan is that the military is viewed as the only viable institution that can deliver results, while a lot of its security worldview is also paradoxically responsible for some of the mess that we are in today. And that is the kind of a paradox which has continued for decades, and it's an unresolved one, and we'll see how this transforms. The second problem with the implementation of the National Action Plan is that Pakistani constitution in the recent years has also undergone major shifts through constitutional amendments which have empowered the provinces, and it is no longer the kind of centralized state that Pakistan, say, 10 or 20 years ago was. Over 110 functions purely belonging to the federal government were devolved to the provinces in 2010, 2011, and 2012. The finances, the federal taxes, the bulk of share goes to the provinces, and a lot of de-radicalization measures, whether they have to do with changing of narratives, improvement of education system, police reform, local government reform, are purely provincial domains. And the provinces have not been on board in both the formulation of NISP and, to a great degree, the National Action Plan. Although the National Action Plan came through a consensus by the political parties, but it was a kind of a centralized process which was then told to the provinces that you have to implement it. How far they own it, how far they're going to put in their own money remains to be seen. And in the provincial management of internal security, there's also a dichotomy that is emerging, which is that, while the chief minister of a province is in charge of the home affair, the internal security affairs, the police, the intelligence, civilian intelligence operations, the so-called apex committees, which are coordinating the implementation of National Action Plan, are being led by the army chief. So in January, there were 2 meetings held in the Punjab and Khyber Pakhtunkhwa provinces, where the army chief was leading these meetings, and the chief ministers, who are elected and in charge, constitutionally mandated with the various functions they have to deliver, were there as participants or senior distinguished participants or panelists. so there's a bit of a anomaly there, and because you have a civilian government, you have a democratic order, but in effect it is the military which is in the driving seat and implementing the National Action Plan. I think that the third issue that is going to impact the implementation of these counterterrorism measures and these policy frameworks. And by the way, these policy frameworks are just fine. I mean, there can be problems with certain formulation or certain definitions, but by and large, they address all the areas. They talk about de-radicalization, they talk about madrasas, they talk about mosque reforms, they talk about education improvement, change in curricula, police reforms, prosecution reforms. So, there's a whole laundry list which is there. So one cannot have pick much bone with these plans. But the real question is whether these plans are owned by the provincial administrations, whether they're going to give the resources, whether they feel empowered enough to implement that or see that as a centralized dicta by the federal government and the military in particular. And more importantly, whether the external security parameters which define Pakistan's view of its insecurity are going to change. And these are in summary related to the India and Afghanistan policy. On Afghanistan, we do see a shift with the military making a very direct effort to engage with the new Afghan government in building confidence, in seeking their support to eliminate the TTP hideouts. But on India, it's all stalled. It is stalled. The diplomatic engagement broke down in August 2014. Since then, there have been no public, official, diplomatic talks of any level, of any kind. Secondly, the Indian Prime Minister has also, to appease his own constituency, has taken a hard line on Pakistan. And Indian public opinion also does not seem very interested in engaging with Pakistan. And in Pakistan, that there are very few advocates who really want the India policy to change. So that's the dilemma that is going to impact, because if the private militias that act as arms of Pakistan's security policy towards India remain in place, they are going to support laterally or covertly the jihad infrastructure. And Pakistan's action plan against terrorism cannot succeed if the jihad infrastructure is not unpacked, undone, and morphed into something different. And one last minute, Mohit. Sorry for the stepping over my time. And so this particular dilemma pervades the larger internal security debate. I think one final point that has to be made is that the overt or the over emphasis on the Taliban, whether they're Afghan or they're Pakistan or the India-centric militias, is well known here in Washington and elsewhere. But actually, the crux of the internal security challenge now is sectarian outfits that have grown in number, in their power, in their outreach, and that are largely based out of Punjab, but have now, found new sanctuaries in Sindh province, in Balochistan for various reasons. And they provide not just the foot soldiers to the Pakistani Taliban, but also drive the ideological agenda of the larger, Sunni extremism in country. And that requires a far more complex and delicate strategy to deal with, and that is still largely unaddressed, because crackdowns are easy. You can go and arrest 500 clerics, shut down a few dozen madrasas and mosques, confiscate hate materials. But what do you do? What do you do next? For that, you have to have a larger internal discourse within Pakistani society and within the Islamic theological parameters, and look at sources within Islam that promote harmony and tolerance. Because at the moment, it's a kind of a hotbed, a time bomb that is ticking. And what needs to be done? Well, basically, I think There are three issues here. The national NACTA, which is the National Anti-Terror Counter-Terrorism Authority, is the leading or a Pakistani version of Homeland Security is the driver of these counter-terrorism measures. Thus far, it has not been funded. Despite so many years, it has a very thin staffing expertise, and many of the functions it is supposed to perform, and most importantly of intelligence coordination between civil and military, remain unimplemented. And the Prime Minister is the leader of that. The NACTA did not even meet for a whole year until this Peshawar tragedy happened, and then the Prime Minister gave the orders for its board to meet. So it has to be given the due importance. If you look at the example of Sri Lanka, which combated private militias fighting the state, there was a far more engagement by the office of the Prime Minister in leading the operations. The second is resourcing, which I've already mentioned, and the third then comes to the kind of institutional arrangements that you need, and for that, without effective police reforms and local government reform and education reform, all these action plans would not have long-term impact, sadly.
Thanks, Raza. Clearly, I've not been a good moderator so far, so I'm hoping for some self-regulation. Mr. Hamid.
That's the disadvantage of speaking last, I guess. Thank you, Raza. I'll just briefly be talking about the approach that has been taken by the government in Pakistan, and what are the merits to my mind and the demerits of that approach, that the recent initiatives, and kind of the way forward, I think, because the big question that Moeed wanted me to talk about was whether law enforcement can deliver, whether it has delivered in the past, and what needs to be done for that to happen in future. So the initial reaction, as Raza has briefly pointed out, has been post-Peshawar, as there has been a 21st Amendment in the Constitution, which essentially what it does is that it has created jurisdiction for military courts in cases where there are special terrorism incidents, and under the Protection of Pakistan Act, which was passed last year. And so that creates jurisdiction for special military tribunals. But that only happens once a case is referred to these military courts by the federal government. There has been a removal of the moratorium, as Raza was already talking about. The impact of that has been, there has been this demand by all law enforcement agencies for a very long time that we keep talking about the judicial system or the legal system not delivering, but there are hundreds of people who are convicted terrorists, so why are they not being punished? That moratorium has now been removed, and so the executions have already started, and this is just related to the cases of terrorism. So what is the efficacy or otherwise of that? I think that's a debate that can, theoretically that's fine, but I think that happens even in the US and in other countries. So in this case, I think it has been kind of a special dispensation, which from a law enforcement point of view, I think I would support that. There are cases, many of the jailbreaks that have happened in the past, a very large part of the motivation was to spring these people out of these jails. So I think it at least removes that kind of incentive from the prison, removes the pressure from there. The National Action Plan, the 20-point agenda that Raza was talking about, the one point that keeps coming up again and again is that the military has taken a dominant role, although there have been at least two, all parties conferences. One aspect that has not been talked about is that there has been a very severe threat to schools in, all over Pakistan. Schools remained closed for at least a month. And every parent knows what kind of psychological impact that has on your children and your families when your schools are not open. So now the schools have opened with enhanced security measures across Pakistan, and those measures are still ongoing. There are infrastructure improvement, walls are going up, CCTV, all those kinds of measures that are even now going on. And so I'll just be talking about I think the merits and the demerits of these recent initiatives. I think the biggest merit of this whole approach has been that it has a lot of signaling value. I mean, there has been a lot of criticism in the sense that, you know, the military is not doing this, the military is not doing that, or there has been lackluster law enforcement. I think at least from a signaling point of view, getting everyone on board, the political forces as well as all of the law enforcement forces, I think it has been a big plus, at least in this case, that everyone is on board and there has been an amendment in the Constitution which is through consensus. So whatever is decided regarding the, you know, how this constitutional amendment goes, because there already has been a legal challenge to it, and the matter has now been taken up by the Supreme Court. There is a hearing tomorrow in the Supreme Court, so it's an open question whether the constitutional amendment remains. But one important kind of caveat is that it is only for 2 years, so that means that it has already a sunset clause built into it in the constitutional amendment as well as the amendment in the Army Act. So the hope is that in the next 2 years, if the military courts or the, you know, the special law that is being, you know, the Protection of Pakistan Ordinance, if they have an impact, you know, then that means that hopefully by the end of those 2 years, we wouldn't need these military courts anymore and we would revert back to our judicial system. I mean, that is the hope. Although, you know, I'll talk about the demerit of that also. The second kind of big merit is that, you know, it institutes some process. Because the other option then is that you go out and resort to extrajudicial killing, which I think no one would advocate. And that also has the added disadvantage of kind of, it does not have any legitimacy in the eyes of the whole society as well as the people who are involved. So when you have some kind of a process, however flawed you might think the process is, I think that's better than having no process and resorting to kind of things that are outside of the law. And in any case, it adopts a legal and a constitutional mechanism. And if the courts then decide that this mechanism is not constitutional, obviously that legal challenge has already been sprung, so there can be adjudication on that. But for the time being, you know, this is how the state of the affairs is on ground. So I think in terms of these, there are these two big advantages. As far as the issues the critics would point out about the, you know, the problems with this, you know, obviously the biggest kind of issue about this would be the whole legitimacy question. So if there is no due process, or if the equal protection of laws is taken away, then the, you know, the point of having a judicial system or a legal process is undermined, which is that, you know, if this kind of a process does not have legitimacy in the eyes of the broader society, then obviously that is a kind of a driver of extremism or terrorism. So that is kind of a big criticism. But that has to be addressed, I think, in the days to come. The other kind of big criticism would be that, you know, this is a kind of a shortcut. It's a cop-out. We are not trying to address the larger issues of the judicial system or of the law enforcement system. And those deficiencies are well documented. Everyone knows what those deficiencies are. I'll be briefly talking about those as well. And those are that in a legal system which was primarily meant for essentially rural kind of law enforcement in a rural society, with the passage of time, we have not been able to evolve that legal system. We have not been able to kind of evolve it to a point where it could do adequate urban policing and adequate counter-terrorism functions. We have not been able to do that, so we are trying to use the same legal or judicial system to fight terrorism. And I think it's kind of like asking a doctor to, you know, fight today's diseases with tools that are maybe a century and a half old. So that is obviously a very big kind of handicap. So in that sense, if you do not address the larger issue of judicial system reform and law enforcement reform, then naturally, in the long run, what happens after the 2 years? So that is, you know, a big question mark in that sense. The reaction of the superior courts, obviously, that remains to be seen. So naturally, that is an outstanding issue. And another kind of big issue that I think we have to recognize is that military cannot, you know, fix all of these solutions. And it's not kind of a Hercules that has the you know, the whole burden of the earth on its shoulders. It cannot be the only institution that tries to solve all problems. So you have to invest in civilian institutions. You have to take care of the deficiencies that you identify and try and support this kind of anti-terrorism effort that is going on. There has been some investment, some effort towards that, but not adequate. So naturally, that has to be a very big priority in terms of the future course of action. As far as I'm cognizant of the limited time. So as far as the way forward is concerned, I think we have to address at least these three big issues, which is the legitimacy question. And so you have to build in, my kind of feeling or sense would be that if the matter goes, as the matter has gone to the Supreme Court, it might ask that some additional protections be built into the law as it stands today. So if there are some, due process and equal protection of law safeguards built into, or the court demands that they be built into this law, I think that would be a positive step that would probably be welcome by almost everyone. The second thing that needs to be fixed is the long-term kind of issues with the legal and the judicial system. So, myself and Mueed had a discussion about the best approach towards counter-terrorism in Pakistan, and we agreed that the kind of approach that Italy took in terms of the mafia when they had this huge issue in Sicily, I think that would be the approach to be taken, where you do not have effective witness protection programs and where your judicial system depends a lot on oral testimony of witnesses. That's how the law is. Then obviously there has to be a shift away from oral testimony towards forensic evidence. And then there has to be a shift away from kind of open court trials towards trials which protect the identity not only of the investigators but also of the prosecutors, of the witnesses, and of the judges themselves. So I think that has to be done in days to come, and I think there already has been some progress towards that. Witness protection programs are, at least in law, now being built into the ATA law, and as they are developed in days to come, I think there would be a lot of progress towards that. There are some, difficult issues with regard to burden of proof. The burden of proof, as in all common law jurisdictions in Pakistan, lies on the prosecution. But people who have a law background know that there are strict liability kind of offenses also, where and the U.S. Supreme Court actually developed that law about a century ago, and it is a very well-developed law. And in the case of narcotics, Pakistan and many other legal jurisdictions around the world have a very well-defined strict liability kind of jurisdiction, which is that if narcotics are recovered, the burden of proof shifts to the defense. I think a similar kind of thing needs to be done, especially in the case of explosives or suicide vests or those kinds of things, that there have been cases where tons of explosives were recovered, and unfortunately, because the burden of proof was on the prosecution, those cases could not get conviction. So I think that is a big step towards, and there has been some movement, at least in the Protection of Pakistan Act, towards shifting that burden of proof in cases of recoveries of explosives and things like that. Then one very major kind of thing that needs to be done, and I think being here in the US, I would take this opportunity to highlight this, is that the civilian law enforcement agencies have done a wonderful job in Pakistan. That has not been recognized widely. When you look at all of the major cases that have happened, and when you look back at least at the things that were happening in Pakistan in 2009 and 10, you see a marked change today. You look at the number of incidents that has gone down, you look at the places which had been taken over. It's partly because of the military operations in Swat and Waziristan, but a large part of that contribution was made by the civilian law enforcement agencies. And a lot of good work, which was a lot of good policing work and a lot of intelligence-led police work, that has resulted in a lot of people being caught and punished in courts. So I think that needs to be recognized, and there has to be a lot of investment in the counter-terrorism department that has been now set up in Punjab. It is now being set up in Sindh. It has already been set up in Balochistan and KPK. So a lot of investment needs to go towards that side in order to support the law enforcement anti-terror function on an ongoing basis. It cannot be a one-off kind of thing and then you leave it at that. And that can only happen if it is done on a consistent day-to-day basis through regular law enforcement agencies. And you cannot have vacuums like FATA or Balochistan's B area where you do not have regular law enforcement, because that vacuum then leads to terrorist sanctuaries. That cannot be allowed to happen. So I think these are two big kind of things that need to be done in days to come. And I think the other, Raza has already talked about investing in NACTA and more and better intelligence coordination. And other than that, there are broader issues of mainstreaming and curriculum reform. I would not talk about that here because that's not my area of expertise. But my kind of the message is that a lot of good work has already been done. These institutions have already delivered. I mean, look at the situation now, and when you compare it with the Middle East, what has the complete meltdown of many institutions that you see around the Middle East. You compare that with the challenge that was there in Pakistan 4, 5, 6 years ago. You compare it with today, so it's not really that bad a situation. But obviously, going from here on, I think the things that I have talked about need to be taken care of. Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks a lot for making up for my bad performance. My punishment is that I'm not going to take the prerogative to ask any questions. Let me open it up to all of you and see if you have questions to any of our panelists. And if we can keep the questions very short, again, to make up for my bad performance. Let's start from here if we can. The one behind you. We'll start from there. Ladies first.
Thank you very much for this presentation. I'm Elaine Soreo, and I really enjoyed starting off with the diagrams presented by Dr. Peter Lavoie. Reminds me of Mandelbrot's, the clusters, that is. What I'd like to ask is, where do we see now the intersection between the kind of narrative, from master narrative, that you described, Dr. Lavoie, to the clustering that we saw from the databases, and that intersecting with what Mr. Rami has addressed in terms of the cultural developments and movements and attitudes in Pakistan. In other words, the capacity that we've unfortunately seen, I think even the Pakistanis feel that the capacity for maybe denying the situations over the years, and now has come to such a head as we've recently seen in Peshawar. How do you see this going forward with beyond these particular the particular government actions of NAP, which is indeed significant, but we've seen sort of significant things said and done in the past, and they've sort of petered out. So where do you gentlemen see this all going? And that would also include Mr. Hamid, because I think his point about the civilian role is incredibly important. Thank you.
Thanks. Let's collect 2 or 3, and then we can have answers. Can we go here?
Thank you very much, all panelists, for the good points that you raised. I'm Sabghatullah at Georgetown University. I'm from Afghanistan. If we look to the history of the tribal areas, federally administered tribal areas, I'm really surprised that still in the Pakistani narrative, I do not see the very basic issue to be addressed. All the narrative that came after the Peshawar incident is more symptomatic treatment narrative, judicial authority given, jurisdiction given to military and all that. But if we look to the history of FATA, in 60s we see the problem in Swat, in 70s we see problem in South Waziristan Agency, the military operations. South Waziristan Agency was bombed by fighter jets. Maulana Nur Muhammad was sent to prison. Then in 90s we see again the Mahmud Agency and Swat problem. The Tehreek Taliban of Pakistan looks kind of continuation of all that issue. And if we look deeper into this, status of the federally administered tribal area is probably one of the several factors, and I'm not seeing that being addressed in the Pakistani narrative of the story. This is one thing. Second thing is that...
Can we just take one? Because we have a lot of hands.
Okay,
And thank you. Thank you so much. Marvin?
Marvin Weinbaum, Middle East Institute. Peter, I'm nonplussed by your major finding here about ethnic differences here being the major narrative. Why? Well, for one thing, anti-Punjab feeling predates anything that we've seen here with extremism. And perhaps it was stronger in the past. Most of the people who are the voices in the Twitters and the newspapers, which are mainly Punjab, most of your data comes from the Punjab. More than that, the reflection of those ethnic differences here. Certainly, it's hard to imagine that they are reflecting the views of Baluch nationalists or Sindhi nationalists. There's something here that just doesn't ring correctly. And for example, if they're reflecting the TTP and the origins of the TTP, well, the TTP's actions are mainly against Pashtuns. They're not directed against Punjabis. And the fear here of the Saraki southern Punjabs is they're already Punjabi. Having said all that, one further thought. If you had asked me what I thought would be the major narrative, and it doesn't appear at all in your findings, is the government's policies. Is it possible that what you got really is reflection on government policies where the government is viewed as Punjabi dominated?
Thanks. Reza, you want to start?
Okay, very quickly, I think I just want to respond to the issue that Marvin's also raised, which is that I think the ethnic perceptions do matter a lot in this whole narrative. I mean, Pakistan's militancy is so hydra-headed. It's not just the Taliban, or it's not just the sectarian groups, but there is political violence in Karachi. There is Baloch insurgency in Balochistan. There is growing, small-scale Sindhi sort of movement as well. And so all of this flows from the perceptions of Punjab being the dominant province, of having appropriated the national resources, and having forced its policy framework, particularly the security policy worldview, onto the smaller provinces. And it is also a historical reality that Pakistan's three smaller provinces are far less anti-India than the Punjab is. And Punjab is the dominant province. Sindhis, Baloch, and the Pakhtuns have always had a different view on that. And I think on this issue of things petering out, well, that is the real issue here, that General Musharraf announced identical points in 2002 and 2003. If you read his speeches, and I was going through them, he took the same line, and there was action taken within the first few years, and then it all faded. Why? I mean, this is a larger question. And on narratives, I think, Peter, I would like to make a comment on, which you also mentioned, that, the Urdu media or the vernacular media in Pakistan is what drives the public opinion. It is xenophobic, jingoistic, anti-West, and has been supporting the militants. And one example of that is that when the Pakistan army raided, actually started operation in North Waziristan, in one of the hideouts where the TTP bombers were being trained, they found copies of major Urdu columns that have been promoting the Taliban cause for a decade now.
Thanks. Peter?
Thank you for those comments and questions. So, Marvin, if you saw everything in my brief as totally unsurprising, then I'd be disappointed. So I'm glad you found something to try, because I was trying to control the Marvin Weinbaum bias in Washington's understanding of these events. But more seriously, I would have expected the ethnic dimension to be much less prominent than I saw it too, because for the same reason. I mean, I read those columnists, we're familiar with the same thing. Most of them are Punjabi. Most of them are Punjabi Sunni. Most of them are the dominant sort of demographic of the country. And yet, this came out as a very, I think, startling finding that there is an ethnic dimension in much of the conversation. And I think probably when I would read these things, my bias, because having been to Pakistan, for so long, over the last couple of decades, I tended to assume these are the fundamental realities. They do date back to decades, actually, much longer than decades, even before independent Pakistan. And so we take these for granted. So we don't see them. But when you let the kind of data speak for itself and not us kind of coloring our interpretation, it really jumps out much more prominently. I'll just note, whenever I go to give a talk at Qaidi-e-Azam or some university and, the students in Pakistan, the thing that jumps out at me and where the real emotion, real frustration and grievance is on ethnic mistreatment more than any other issue. So I think it's there, and I think we've grown immune to this over time. So just a reaction. And I do think it did predate this violence, but I think there is a very legitimate, now here's my personal view, it's a very legitimate concern that Pashtuns and Baluch and others should be raising, that the dominant forces in the government and the security establishment allow the violence and do not resource the problem as actively and somehow and often perpetuate the problem when it's in the margins of the country, not in the core of the country. And I think that behavior over time is largely why we have these problems. I mean, and going to the gentleman from Afghanistan's point on Fatah, I think personally the decades of mismanagement of the tribal areas in Pakistan, this is, if I had to attribute one prominent cause to the problems we have, I would lay it at the doorsteps of that government neglect and mistreatment and mismanagement of the tribal areas. Final point on the vernacular media, I think, is such a strong point. When I was in Lahore studying Urdu, I would be reading the Urdu media, and I'd also read Friday Times. I don't know what you call that. That's not even the normal mainstream. That's a little bit, but I love Friday Times. And it's two different Pakistans.
Totally.
And there are, so I think I would fully acknowledge this is one view. That's a narrative of one segment of Pakistani elite, but there are many other Pakistans. And to get to the young woman's point on the future, you really do need to reconcile these different viewpoints to get a political base for action going forward. I think all of the recommendations that both my colleagues identified, they're all the right things that need to be done. But if you don't have a political base for support, how can you sustain that progress?
And going back to Sibghatullah's point, I would point out, Sibghatullah, that this issue with FATA is not just with 60s and 70s. It actually goes back to 1840s and 1860s. So when you keep looking at historical records, every 10 years or 15 years, you would have even the British find that British would be sending a punitive column to now to Kala Dhaka or now to Waziristan, and then you had Fakir of Ippi, and then you had Churchill fighting in Malakand, all of those things. So it's not as if it's a very recent phenomenon or it's just in the 60s or the 70s. So the area, obviously because of the underdevelopment and it's a mountainous area, it's difficult to develop. And I would agree with Peter that it has not been well developed, it has not been well integrated. And what you're talking about, you are absolutely right, it is symptomatic treatment, but when you're talking about law enforcement, I mean, that is what you do. As far as, and good law enforcement cannot go without good kind of nation building. So you need to develop good infrastructure, you need to develop a policy where you can integrate it into the mainstream, and the mainstreaming into the legal system, into the administrative system of Pakistan. I think that would be a big step forward for FATA.
Thank you. We'll take one more round and then unfortunately we'll have to close. And there are way too many hands. The lady here. Okay. Short, please.
Okay, it's Nazrana. I'm from Pakhtunkhwa. Thank you very much, Raza and everybody. My question is, I was just reading reports today which are coming from Peshawar, and teachers there, government of Pakhtunkhwa is giving training to teachers, including female teachers, to operate guns.
Yeah.
Right? So this we have done it in the past as well, right? We have armed Aman Lashkars to do that, to fight Taliban. And in the last 1 year or 2 years' time, we have seen that 500 Aman Lashkar members have been killed by the Taliban. So are we putting our teachers on the front?
Fair enough. Good question. All the way in the back. Sorry, I know there are too many hands. I just have to.
Hi, my name is Saeed Nazir Afridi. I'm a Humphrey Fellow from tribal areas of Pakistan. I'm a journalist. I'm displaced by the conflict. I'm living in Peshawar. My family lives in Peshawar. So I think the hanging of terrorists is not a solution to the problem because they are not afraid of death. And there should be some permanent solution. And my question to Raza Rumi is that in presence of army courts, what do you think that it would not be used against the Baloch nationalists, and it would not be used against the missing persons who the army was reluctant to produce them in the civil courts? So I'm afraid of that it will be used against them.
Okay. Gentleman there, and we'll end with that, have the panelists speak. And I promise to hold them to fire if they leave before answering everybody else's questions.
Hi, Doug Brooks with the Afghan American Chamber of Commerce. And I guess my question would be, with Ashraf Ghani's visit to Pakistan, are the Pakistanis seeing Afghanistan in a different way and possibly as a partner in taking on these issues?
Okay. Start from there and then end.
Going back to the possibility of abuse of military courts, that problem has I've identified that there is a possibility. I mean, at least it has been highlighted by several people in the press and those kinds of things. And it's because of that during the debates in the assembly, they built in an additional kind of protection that the military courts would only take up cases which were referred to them by the federal government. And secondly, they also built a proviso into the language of the constitutional amendment itself, which said that it could not be used against political parties or political groups, only against terrorism and those kinds of things. Having said that, and it also has a sunset clause of 2 years. Having said that, this is a legitimate concern, and obviously the Supreme Court would also grapple with it. And I think if they think that this language is too overbroad, then they can obviously direct the government to come up with a different language and maybe amend it or whatever. So that, I think, there is a kind of a solution within the system, I think.
Thank you. I would just say, maybe to summarize, I mean, obviously this problem is so big and it is just so devastating to, I mean, each one of you, some of you have experienced displaced people having to be basically in the United States now and not back in your homeland because of these problems. So far be it from me to try to tell you about the gravity of this problem. You all experience this personally. And probably everybody in this room has friends and family that have also experienced the violence in Pakistan or terrorist violence elsewhere. So I think recognizing the seriousness of the problem and the urgency of solving the problem is the first step. And I think, what I would just reflect, the narrative landscape is shifting in Pakistan to do that. That is necessary for action, but it's insufficient. I mean, you do need the government to take serious action. You need the civilians and the military to become aligned and work together as opposed to cross purposes. And you need the central government to work with the provinces and the tribal areas in a coordinated manner. And there are many specific measures, and I think the judicial and police reforms, educational reforms, et cetera, that are absolutely essential. But you can't do that unless you get the team out operating as one. And I think this is something where the U.S., the West, other countries, we should really galvanize our support to try to influence these outcomes and resource these outcomes. Because Pakistan, the other problem, it's broke. And a lot of these measures do take resources to do them. I would just say one thing, and I just really want to end by complimenting Moeed for putting on this panel. I think more dialogues like this that we can really grapple with these issues and help, and you should all, and what USIP does so well is help U.S. Congress and U.S. administration and our elite and media elite in our country to understand these issues, put a little more pressure on our government to take action, and to put a little more pressure on the Pakistan and other governments to take action, I think is absolutely the right thing. So I want to thank you.
Thanks.
I also just, final point, want to say to Raza, I think it is the security, again, my personal view, the security establishment in Pakistan does have too cozy an alliance with militant groups in that country. This is a pattern over time. Look, the U.S. has done that in other parts of the world. We did it in Afghanistan with the Mujahideen. We now have understood the problems of that policy, and we're trying to, we've changed our ways. Pakistan still faces an excruciating security problem, and the military just does not have the self-confidence to do this. So I would say more broadly, there is a regional strategic angle here too, and I do suspect this is something that President Obama was talking to Prime Minister Modi about. So hopefully India, Afghanistan, and Pakistan and others can help address the security problem.
Thank you, Peter, also for the additional points. I'm a bit outraged because I'm a Punjabi, and we consider the army, Islam, and Pakistan as the same things. So whenever there's a critique of security establishment, the Pakistani nationalism gets a bit jolted. So anyway, that was a lighter note. But I think I would like to, the issue of FATA was raised, and the long-term multiple jurisdictions in Pakistan was also raised. I think deep down, the problem is that the citizen-state relationship in Pakistan remains fractured and fragmented. Nearly half of Pakistan's territory is governed or is an ungoverned space. Whether it's FATA, parts of Balochistan, South Punjab, even Karachi, and parts of Khyber Pakhtunkhwa, you don't have courts, you don't have police, you don't have the regular administrative apparatus, and these are being governed by the 19th century frameworks which the British left. I think part of that is a completely unaddressed debate. The second issue that I would like to raise is about the media, and I would like to point out that there's one colleague of ours here in the third or the fourth row who took out the only liberal Urdu paper, and a few months ago there was a mob which said that you've committed blasphemy, and he was about to be charged with that, which means murder. And he had to escape and flee to the US. So this is the dire situation about the narratives. That is where I think the most important investment needs to be done. The results of your work are extremely impressive, and I hope that they inform the policymakers as well, and there are more Pakistani outputs doing that for vernacular media, because this is a war of narratives and opinions and perceptions.
Well, thank you very much. Let me just take 1 minute and end on a provocative note by throwing out some things that I think we didn't touch upon or touched upon but haven't answered and may want to do in the future, and then we'll thank our panelists. One, we've talked about narratives, but quite honestly, how do, Raza, you bring up narratives from within the religious space that are moderate when every single moderate religious cleric is taken down before anybody else? That's one. Second, Peter, you've talked about narratives here. What about state-created narratives? I think that's an important thing that is overlooked often. I think the Pakistani state has been fairly good where it's wanted, Swat being one example and others. So what about that? How does that sort of fit into this? Third, on narratives, can the US do anything? Or is the only approach going to be do no harm because it's such a sensitive issue? I think these are things that we need to look at. Ethnic discontent, one hears of this. I've grown up in Pakistan hearing this. The question we need to answer is, number one, what do you do about it? Because I suspect it's more than just putting more non-Punjabis in key positions. We've had that, that doesn't work. Is it about the makeup of the federation and the provinces and the sizes? Is it something to do with that, or do we have to look elsewhere? Second, I think we need to look more critically at this whole idea of Punjabis speaking as Punjabis. Because they've been a majority, actually, Punjabi nationalism doesn't exist, nearly to the extent that other provinces do. So the institution that we blame for sort of having dominated this Punjabiization is the only institution I know who actually doesn't think ethnically, which is the military in some ways. So I think we need to think more on what Punjabi nationalism actually means. And finally, the last two things. One, I think analysts like me and others have been fairly unfair when we talk about use of force options, because there's a sense of excitement when we ask a country or when we see a country go after terrorists with force. And then as soon as they go after them with force, there is all this criticism about too much force and the wrong kind of force, and it shouldn't be done. So I think we need to think more about what does use of force mean, what kind of use of force is okay, where, and where it's not. And I don't think we've done enough to sort of think through this. And finally, I think this sort of million-dollar question, Raza, is this larger strategic space that Peter has also mentioned and all of you have. I think the question is, where do you find the real indicators and signs of things changing? Because even if Pakistan were to sort of completely change its ways, I, for one, would not see Pakistan going after all these groups simultaneously. So how do you actually craft a policy that is sequential, but you also are clear that it's a policy that's a divorce from the past? I think that's really the analytical question to answer. Thank you, all of you, for coming. I'm sorry for going over time, but please join me in thanking the panelists.
That was indeed a million-dollar question. I think that's good to see you. Yeah? We're based out of Islam. Yes. So we'll up and down. So just drop me a line. Whatever works. Just drop me a line. Good.
Email of
Where is the bank? Also my batchmate from GMG left the service.
वो तो फिर bad luck है, लेकिन उसके अलावा आज अच्छा अच्छा you also
ये बहुत बड़ी fraternity है. It's bigger than
the ones that didn't last or didn't want to last.
Did last, want to leave. All of this.
All, thank you for joining us for this panel on Pakistan's security situation. My name is Moeed Yusuf. I direct the South Asia program here at USIP and have been here for too long to remember. But today's event is really special, at least for me, but also for Pakistan watchers. Because I don't think any of us who are interested in this country and what has been going on there for the past decade or so can forget the 16th of December 2014. And I don't think any of us will. This is, of course, the Peshawar attack on the Army Public School. 150 or upwards is the number of young innocent kids killed in that attack. And you've heard all sorts of stories of survivors, of those who didn't survive, of parents, of the government, etc. What we are here to discuss is what came out of this at the Pakistan government and state level. I was in Pakistan throughout this period, just before Peshawar happened, then when it happened, and then the 2 weeks after. And I have to say that I personally have not seen the Pakistani people and the state moved in a way that this attack did. I mean, there have been many horrendous attacks in Pakistan before this, but there was something about this which really shook everybody, and it's quite obvious what it was. The hope then, of course, was that after this, the state will actually get its act together on some of the things that it hasn't managed to so far, and that this will really be a turning point for Pakistan in its fight against terrorism. And there have been a number of steps that have been taken by the government and the various provincial authorities since, which I let my speakers talk to. But the real question we want to answer today is, what does all of this mean? Pakistan has come up with various security policies, various security strategies over the past 4, 5, 6, 7. We'll just give it a couple more minutes and then we'll begin. Thanks.
If you're too long,
Good afternoon. He is a habitual or addicted Twitter fan, whichever way you want to put it, and virtually everything else. But he's somebody who's very well recognized for his commentary on Pakistani politics. He also is somebody who had the unfortunate event of being attacked by militants in Pakistan not too long ago. And that's one of the reasons that he came to the US. Mr. Zulfikar Hamid is an even more special guest. He happens to be in Washington right now with the New America Foundation, but he's a serving Pakistani police officer who served as the Deputy Inspector General of Investigations in Lahore and has held various other senior police posts in the Punjab. And one of the reasons to have him here is this whole talk about Punjab and southern Punjab being the hotbed of extremism but not being touched, and there's all sorts of controversies around that. So we'll hear from the horse's mouth, if you will, on what the challenges of security and policing and counterterrorism in Punjab are. So with that, let me stop here and go to my guests. We'll start with Peter, come to Raza, and then go to Mr. Hamid, and then we'll open it up for questions. Thanks.
Okay, thank you very much, Moeed, and thank you for the opportunity to be here and an opportunity to discuss this very, very important issue. And it's a very hard issue to talk about as well. We're really talking about not just one event that has catalyzed the nation of Pakistan into a desire for action, but frankly, when I was serving in the government and other points, I've heard this said so many times before. After Benazir Bhutto's assassination, after other really notable, terrible attacks in the country, after the attack on the Karachi airport that galvanized public opinion, and most recently, this terrible attack on the
7 years. Some very high-profile ones, like the National Internal Security Policy last year, which went through a whole process of consensus building over a year, and then they came up with an internal security document. A new one that we hear, or a new term we hear after Peshawar, is the National Action Plan, and there are many others. What does all of this amount to? Are we really looking or looking at a point where things are going to take a turn for the better, irreversibly so, or is this just a blip where things may go back to where they've been? To talk about all of this, we have a very special panel, and I'm grateful to the three panelists here for joining us. I'll introduce them very briefly. None of them actually need any introductions. I'm sure all of you have either heard or seen or met them. But let me just quickly introduce them, and then we'll get to business. Peter Lavoie, to my left, long time Pakistan expert, has lived in Pakistan, speaks the native language. He is now a partner at Monitor 360, a Washington-based firm. Before that, he was the acting assistant secretary for defense at the DoD. He served in the office of the National Intelligence Director and various other hats before that. He's been an academic as well. But if anybody knows sort of the nuclear and non-proliferation field in South Asia, you wouldn't have missed Peter's name. So Peter, thank you very much for being here. To my right is my current colleague, Raza Rumi, who is a senior Pakistan expert at USIP, is doing a very interesting study on internal security in Pakistan for us, and he'll be speaking through parts of that study today. Raza otherwise is a former Pakistani civil servant, and he wears more hats than I care to remember, to be honest. He's been with the Asian Development Bank, he's a journalist, he's anchored a TV program.